What else you
Jones.
got, dog?
I have the ending.
Fate continued to play a role in Dred Scott's life, however, because remember Irene, the widow of Emerson, the army doctor, the one that the Scotts originally sued to get their freedom? Yeah, well, she remarried a guy named Calvin Chaffee, a congressman from Massachusetts who was a staunch abolitionist. And apparently he just didn't know that she claimed ownership over the Scotts. Anyway, he found out a couple months before the Supreme Court decision came down, probably because newspapers nationwide were like, hey, you know this insane Supreme Court case, Scott v. Sandford, that we're all waiting to see to determine the outcome of slavery in America? Yeah, well, Chaffee, that abolitionist congressman, his wife is the one who claims to own them. So Chaffee's pissed and embarrassed and transfers ownership of the Scotts to Taylor Blow back in Missouri. Again, remember the Blow family? They were the original enslavers of Dred Scott who had spent a lot of time and money and used their connections to help his case for his freedom. Now that they were the rightful owners of the Scotts, they could begin the process of emancipating them. And on May 26, 1857, Dred and Harriet Scott were formally freed in St. Louis Circuit Court by that same judge, Alexander Hamilton. After obtaining his freedom, Dred Scott worked at a hotel in St. Louis, and Harriet worked as a laundress. Unfortunately, Dred Scott died of tuberculosis on September 17, 1858, just 18 months after obtaining his freedom. Harriet would live until 1876. Back in 2017, the podcast More Perfect, which, if you haven't heard of it, is an excellent podcast all about constitutional law and the Supreme Court, I highly recommend. They did an episode called American Pendulum 2 about the Dred Scott case, and they covered a reconciliation summit that was held between the descendants of Dred and Harriet Scott and the descendants of Justice Taney, who wrote this opinion. It's a really interesting look at history and how we talk about it now and reconcile with it now, with a lot of mixed emotions and interesting discussions. I highly recommend.
Okay, so the only thing that I even take from the ending, which, well, two things now. One, once again, that perfect storm for justice. That's the only way, then and now, you happen to marry. Why did you about the smartest woman I know? So you decided that you have a slave and you go to marry somebody who is completely and utterly against slavery.
Yeah,
Also, you also going to be in a time when, as much as men don't have, blacks didn't have power. Women is the next step above with no power. So, you know what? Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to take your slave and give him to somebody else that I know that's going to free them. And there's nothing that you can do because you're a woman. I'm so glad we're at the end of this story, but I just really just feel like I'm glad that I made a decision to go do a more deeper dive into Black history instead of just putting the famous names up there and giving the same speeches and the same this, that, and the other and stuff like that. Now, I don't know what I'm going to do next year because I did not know that systemic racism was going to take up the majority of the month. But it did. And I'm
We'll have
happy.
to be more disciplined next year.
You're joking. So funny. That's never going to happen. But I appreciate I appreciate everybody on here. This was tougher than it was last year getting through this. But I'm glad that we did it. I have there's no issue with me of doing it. But go ahead, Diaz.
No, I was gonna say. I mean, I think they did a good job. Thank you, Anna, for bringing up some of the ideas. And I mean, I think this is a much better way of doing it than it's traditionally done, right? So I wouldn't have any objections to doing pretty much the same thing next year. Just pick a different topic or person or group. Just keep it moving.